there is a dangerous and beautiful place where extremes are the norm, where a single night can last 6 months, where most of the world's fresh water covers the floor of the Earth's largest desert, where minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit is a balmy summer day. Such a contradictory place that turns logic on its head might almost seem to be upside down. And in a sense, it is. For this least known continent, Antarctica, can be found bound in ice at the bottom of the world. It is the coldest, windiest, driest, cleanest, loneliest of places. At the beginning of the 20th century, this distant planet on Earth became the ultimate test of personal and national ambition.
For that generation, the exploration of Antarctica, I think, was very similar to the competition to reach the moon in the 1960s.
It's there, no one's been there, so we've got to make it. And that's what I think all of them felt.
From the first humans to penetrate Antarctica's frozen heart, to scientists who brave bitter winters at the South Pole, explorers have sacrificed greatly to open the Antarctic wilderness to mankind. This is their story.
People recognize that there are places in the world where it's not easy to live and want to feel what it's like to be part of nature in its extreme.
You have the science, you have the exploration, you have basically what I'd call the inspiration.
There is no way that your imagination can prepare you for the magnificence of this place. It's just magnificent beyond belief.
Antarctica, vast, silent, frozen, empty, and, as a result, irresistible. To us, it might seem almost a stage awaiting actors. But the human drama came slowly to the icy continent. Antarctica's interior was not reached until the 20th century. Why did it take so long for curious and expansionist peoples to lay claim to this wilderness? The seeds of Antarctica's inaccessibility were sown millions of years ago, when the supercontinent, Gondwanaland, drifted apart to form the continents that we recognize today.
The last fragmental piece to break apart was Australia and Antarctica, which broke apart and created the great Southern Ocean, which encircles Antarctica today. Once Antarctica was surrounded completely by ocean, it cut itself off from the rest of the Earth's weather patterns, and as Antarctica drifted over the South Pole, it became cold and could not receive warmer weather from up north. And so this is really the reason how Antarctica went into the deep freeze about 40 million years ago.
It has total darkness for 6 months of the year, so there's very little sunlight. And when the sun does come in the summer, it comes at such a very low angle that it doesn't provide a lot of heat. And the resultant is that it's the coldest place on Earth.
Inland temperatures that regularly reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit below zero fostered the growth of Antarctica's most distinctive feature, its ice. About 25 million years ago, an ice sheet began coating the entire continent, which had, in prehistoric times, been a life-rich temperate zone. Today, 7 million cubic miles of ice, a sheet from 1 to 3 miles thick, covers everything but Antarctica's coastal areas and mountaintops.
In the wintertime, the ocean around Antarctica freezes and expands the land area of the Antarctic continent by more than 100%. In other words, the continent doubles in size.
But Antarctica's most dramatic feature of all are its icebergs. They result from the constant downhill flow of glaciers from the interior to the edge of the continent. Slabs of glaciers break off and fall into the sea to form icebergs. These massive forms, some the size of small countries, can have a lifespan of as long as 4 years, circling the continent by the thousands before drifting north and melting. All this ice, on land and sea, formed a natural barrier that kept mankind away from the continent until most of the rest of the world was known. But humans would finally enter this dangerous environment, drawn to it by curiosity and commerce. In the 19th century, sealers in the fur trade ventured further and further south in search of new hunting grounds. Motivated by commerce, not exploration, these sealers were often secretive about their discoveries.
If a sealer found an island with an excellent number of seals, then he shut up about it. He didn't want competition. Secrecy was a major part of the industry. But they did discover almost 2/3 of the peri-Antarctic islands and made the first landings on well over half of them. I believe the first 5 landings on the continent of Antarctica were all made by sealers, but they're hardly known.
The first official landing was credited to an American sealer, John Davis, who set foot on the Antarctic Peninsula in 1821. And wrote in his log, "I think this southern land to be a continent."
Sealing in the 1800s and whaling in the 1900s had a vast amount to do with the exploration of that continent. Indeed, commerce led the way for exploration in many instances.
And ultimately to exploitation as well. Both industries drove their prey to the edge of extinction, and then left the icy waters in search of new hunting grounds. It wasn't until 1895 that an international geographical congress presided over by Sir Clements Markham spurred the nations of the earth to undertake a more comprehensive exploration of the bottom of the world.
The International Geographical Congress in 1895, which met in London and where the geographical societies throughout the world came to a decision that the greatest piece of geographical exploration yet to be undertaken is the Antarctic.
The Geographical Congress inspired a flurry of expeditions from nations around the world during what would be known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, 1895 to 1922. Clements Markham, the president of the Royal Geographical Society and a former midshipman in the British Navy, knew that fame and national honor awaited the first man to place his footprints in the snow at the South Pole. This remote place, the southernmost point on the globe, was mankind's last, greatest unexplored destination. Markham wanted to ensure that it would be conquered by a British naval officer. Markham's selection, Robert Falcon Scott, although an unexceptional officer, possessed exceptional ambition and determination. 32 and lacking polar experience, he nonetheless impressed Markham and was put in charge of the expedition. After a visit from King Edward VII and Queen Alexandria, the Discovery sailed from London on July 31st, 1901 to great fanfare. With 48 men under his command, Robert Falcon Scott was facing an Antarctic unknown, that would test his leadership skills. He and his companions would soon set the tone for heroism and suffering in the heroic age.
Well, unfortunately for Scott, his expedition was the first for 25 years to either polar regions and to the Antarctica for over 60 years. So he didn't have a group of people with him who could say, well, you do this and you do that.
His ship, the Discovery, wintered in McMurdo Sound, frozen into the ice pack. And the scientific team set to work taking meteorological and magnetic readings, collecting wildlife and geological specimens.
The scientific teams were brilliantly equipped and prepared and trained and did what today, in my view, as a scientist, is the most important legacy of the heroic age, namely doing the first science on the most difficult continent to do science on, the frozen continent of Antarctica. And Scott's legacy, in my view, is just that.
But Scott's legacy as an explorer would turn out to be more controversial. His team for the polar journey consisted of his close friend Edward Wilson, who was the expedition doctor and naturalist, and Ernest Shackleton, a charismatic Anglo-Irish merchant seaman. Although Shackleton and Scott both saw a polar journey as a route to fame and advancement, they had little else in common. Shackleton was as extroverted as Scott was introverted, and his common touch made him more popular with the men. On November 2nd, 1902, the three set out for the South Pole. It sits atop 9,000 feet of ice, has an average temperature of minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and without painstaking calculation, cannot be distinguished from the rest of the polar plateau. Its location on the globe, 90 degrees south, is an abstraction. There is no there. Just more wind, ice, and snow.
You've got basically three parts of the journey. The Ross Ice Shelf itself, the mountains and ascending the glacier, and then the polar plateau.
And for travel in the snow, dogs were the only efficient means of pulling supply-laden sledges. Although they brought 19 dogs, Scott was curiously lax about preparing for their use.
Neither Scott, Wilson, nor Shackleton had great expertise with dogs. And dogs get easily bored. Really, they need someone to go on ahead of them. They need encouragement. It doesn't really do to pull alongside the dogs, as Scott was sometimes inclined to do.
The dogs were being fed on the wrong food. They were feeding them on frozen fish, and some of the fish was rotten. So the dogs were in poor condition. And the result was that some of the times they were pulling the dogs along, and the dogs, in some ways, were sitting on the sledges or not pulling, and so it became man-hauling.
Scott would write, "In my mind, no journey ever made with dogs can approach when a party of men go forth to face hardships, dangers, and difficulties with their own unaided efforts. Surely in this case, the conquest is more nobly and splendidly won." This curious reverence for the back-breaking art of man-hauling, the practice of having men pull heavy sledges, cost Scott his goal, the South Pole. On December 30th, hungry and beset by scurvy, a deficiency of vitamin C, they reached their furthest south, 82 degrees 16 minutes. A new, if unspectacular, record. They were less than halfway to the pole and had not left the Ross Ice Shelf after 2 months of hauling when they turned for home. In addition to failing in their attempt, Scott and Shackleton were now barely on speaking terms.
Probably a conflict of personality. I mean, Shackleton, who is this larger-than-life, effusive, a very charismatic figure, and Scott, who is the shy, rather introspective in some ways, complicated leader.
As they retraced their steps, it was now Scott's leadership that would determine the difference between success and failure, between life and death in this challenging environment. Having established a new furthest south record on December 30th, 1902, Robert Scott, Edward Wilson, and Ernest Shackleton were racing against time to get back to their base in McMurdo Sound before starvation and scurvy overtook them. Shackleton was most affected by disease and was, despite his efforts, slowing their return. They had taken the challenge of the Antarctic environment too lightly and were paying the price.
You have to put Captain Scott in the context of the British Empire at the time, and there was a notion that they knew best. The British didn't. They went to Antarctica very inexperienced. None of the men could ski properly. They didn't know how to handle dogs. So they were learning things for the first time, and you could argue that trying to learn things for the first time in Antarctica is a recipe for disaster.
And disaster struck Ernest Shackleton, the toughest of the men, in the form of advanced scurvy. Giddy, breathless, coughing up blood,
Shackleton broke down. He came close to death. And Scott, who was always someone who drove himself, tremendous physical and mental strength, he actually didn't have too much time for people they termed invalids.
A proud man, Shackleton strained to pull his weight. But his relationship with Scott turned as bitter as the weather. The mutable snow conditions, icy one day, sticky the next, made the man-hauling all the more punishing. The remaining two dogs were starving and useless, and Scott ordered Wilson to put them out of their misery. The expedition leader wrote in his diary, "It is ludicrous to think of the ease with which we expected to make our return journey, and the struggle which it has become." Finally, after 3 months, on February 3rd, 1903, battered and lucky to be alive, they returned to the ship which was preparing for another winter in Antarctica. Citing Shackleton's illness, Scott chose to send him home on the relief ship rather than spend another year in Antarctica with a man he may have seen as a rival.
It was Shackleton who was selected by Scott to go home on the relief ship. He didn't want to go home, he wanted to stay. And in fact, of the three of them, Wilson took rather longer to recover from the scurvy than Shackleton.
Once Shackleton got home, he realized he was able to lecture on the expedition and make a name for himself. He'd been invalided home, unfortunately, but he could tell the story about it.
After 3 years of unsuccessful forays into business, journalism, and politics, Shackleton cobbled together the money for his own Antarctic expedition. Meanwhile, following his return from Antarctica on September 10, 1904, Scott attended to his naval career, wrote an account of his journey, and prepared for his wedding to Kathleen Bruce in 1908. Ernest Shackleton returned south aboard the Nimrod with a small crew in August 1907. Ice conditions forced him to winter in McMurdo Sound near Scott's old abandoned headquarters.
He found himself constrained to winter on Ross Island, much, much closer to Scott's base than he wanted to. So again, that's a real source of tension, which Scott really did not understand his reasons for doing that.
Shackleton's shore party of 15 wintered in a 30 by 20-foot hut. He set out for the pole with James Adams, Eric Marshall, and Frank Wild on October 29, 1908. Shackleton had learned little from his earlier trip to the pole with Scott, except that dogs were difficult to handle. His one attempt at innovation was to bring ponies to pull the sledges. They only had value in death.
The ponies, I suppose you can say their principal contribution was their meat, but they had been used successfully in the Arctic, so it was worth a go.
Shackleton was not a great planner. He was not a great organizer. He was, however, a great man. And he was a great leader. And the harder things got, the more disastrous they were, quite often as a result of his lack of planning, then the better he was. He rose to the occasion.
They passed Scott's record in 29 days and ascended the Beardmore Glacier, going into uncharted, treacherous territory. It was hardly pony terrain. Socks, the last surviving pony, disappeared into a crevasse, a deep, hidden crack in the surface of the glacier. The loss of his meat would prove critical.
Once this difficult and slow journey to the top of the glacier is made, then you're on the ice dome itself, the ice cap of the Antarctic. The altitude of that is, on average, about 2,100 meters. And because of the spin of the Earth, the air pressure is far, far lower. Not only are you working much harder, with far less air, frankly, it's far harder to think clearly and work things out in those circumstances.
Under these conditions, Shackleton would have to make the hardest decision of his life. To turn back 700 miles into the journey, a mere 97 miles from the South Pole.
He would have died of starvation if he had used his resources to go to the South Pole. A remarkable expedition because he made what in the history of exploration must have been one of the toughest decisions, which was to turn back knowing he could have got there.
Once again, men suffering from malnutrition were forced to man-haul the sledges. Although northern indigenous peoples had shown dogs to be ideal for travel in the snow, the British had ignored this example and taken ponies that perished.
Their early failures, unfortunately. To say something about a highly organized society that in those days regarded native peoples as ignorant and poor savages who had very little to teach them.
Shackleton had not improved on Scott's methods, but he surpassed Scott's mark and nearly got to the South Pole. They raced home, man-hauling, starving, within inches of their lives.
I think his huge charisma and his focus helped them get as far as they did. I mean, within 100 miles, considering that technologically they hadn't really progressed much from the Discovery expedition, and technically, as I said, with the body temperatures being that low, they should have all been dead, so it was sheer willpower, and that's something Shackleton really enthused in his men, just willpower, wanting to succeed.
I very much like his concept when he wrote to his wife after the return, when he'd reached the farthest south and realized they could get to the pole, but would starve on the way back. He rather hoped his wife would prefer a live donkey than a dead lion.
The live donkey returned to a hero's welcome and was knighted by King Edward VII. Still, he had to lecture relentlessly to pay off the huge debts incurred by the expedition. But a new breed of explorer was about to enter the race to the South Pole, and Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian, had two distinct advantages. He had lived with the Eskimos in the Arctic, and he knew how to keep a secret. Antarctica had been penetrated by Robert Scott's expedition in 1902 and Ernest Shackleton's in 1909, but not quite to its heart. Once news reached civilization that Shackleton's heroic 1909 journey to the South Pole had fallen 97 miles short of its goal, the bottom of the world was once again a prize to be claimed. Two men took up the challenge. They were a study in opposites. Robert Scott was planning his second attempt to reach the South Pole. An officer in the hierarchical Royal Navy, Scott was encumbered by the attitudes of the empire that backed him. At critical points in his polar journey, he would place importance on rank and protocol, values which were irrelevant in the Antarctic wilderness. Roald Amundsen brought a modern tactical approach to exploration and competition, gathering an elite team of men for a specific task, to be first at the South Pole. Amundsen received a love of the cold from his newly independent country of Norway and spent the first decade of the 20th century preparing to be a professional explorer.
How do I think as a polar person? How do I travel in polar regions? I have to learn to drive dogs. I have to be a very competent skier on the sledge. That's going to take some years. He did that. Altogether, he took 12 years to prepare himself as a polar explorer.
He organises his first expedition, which, typical of Amundsen, always ambitious, he's going to be the first man through the Northwest Passage. It doesn't matter that the British Navy has been trying to do this most of the previous century without success. Amundsen, and again this is typical, succeeds. On the process, he winters on King William Island with an Inuit community. And he learns much more about the Inuit, about surviving in the polar regions. And he's a good listener and extremely practical.
Amundsen was very fascinated by people who lived in the cold. What kind of clothing did they wear? Why was the clothing loose? How do they prevent perspiration?
In 1909, Amundsen had assembled financing, a crew, and a vessel on the premise of a North Polar expedition, only to discover that he had been beaten to the mark by Robert Peary, an American naval officer and explorer. When Robert Scott publicly announced his intention to mount an expedition to the South Pole, Amundsen responded daringly. He decided to redesign his expedition to go to Antarctica.
And he didn't tell his men or any of his backers because he felt people would try to interfere or change his plans.
Neither Scott nor the public knew that a race was at hand. Scott's vessel, the Terra Nova, set sail on June 1st, 1910 to great fanfare. The expedition was broad in scope. There were 65 seamen and scientists, 34 dogs, 19 ponies, and 3 track-driven motor sledges. There would be 2 separate exploration parties, one bound for the pole and one to explore King Edward VII land.
The British Empire approach is if 10 men can do a good job, 100 will do it 10 times better. Whereas the Norwegian approach strikes me more like, it's like guerrilla warfare. Each man a specialty in one thing, small group, can move very fast.
2 months later, under cover of darkness, Amundsen set sail aboard his ship, the Fram, with 97 of the best North Greenland sledge dogs and 19 men hand-picked for a race to the South Pole. Amundsen publicly maintained that he was headed north.
And when he headed south, it was a momentous decision that was always considered sneaky by the British authorities.
It was a kind of deception. He left it until halfway to Antarctica to actually tell the world about his plans.
When Amundsen did inform Scott, his telegram was brief, deflating, and not entirely revealing. Beg leave to inform you, Fram proceeding Antarctic. Amundsen. The race was officially on, but Amundsen's team was already working with single-minded focus.
And through the voyage down and their time in camp, each man treated that area of specialty really as a craftsman would treat a great piece of work. They refined, they improved, they experimented, they evaluated. The Scott Party didn't seem to have that clarity on the part of the leader of recognizing what the strengths and weaknesses of the individual men were.
Arriving in January of 1911, Amundsen set up camp in the Bay of Whales, 60 miles closer to the pole than Scott's camp at McMurdo Sound. Amundsen and his men began hauling supplies and setting up food depots for the assault on the pole the next Antarctic summer, November through February. Each depot contained ample rations to feed the men until they reached the next depot on their return journey. The sites were carefully marked with flags so that they could be found in the worst of blizzards. On October 20th, 1911, Amundsen, Olaf Bjaaland, a ski champion, Oscar Wisting, a good handyman, and 2 expert dog team drivers, Helmer Hansen and Sverre Hassel, set out for the South Pole. Unlike their British counterparts, the Norwegians were expert skiers and were disdainful of man-hauling, preferring to let their dogs pull the sleds. 12 days after the Norwegians departed, Scott and his teams began their own journey to the pole.
So Amundsen basically was moving at about almost twice the rate per day that the British were able to move. Plus it was a simpler movement of logistics and men and supplies for Amundsen because it was dogs and sleds and men mostly skiing alongside the dogs, whereas the British had this complex logistical things of tractors, ponies, dogs.
The tractors proved to be little more than a novelty and broke down almost immediately. The ponies, sinking up to their bellies in the snow, starving with their sweat freezing on their hides, were as they had been for Shackleton, only good for their meat. On December 9th, the last 5 starving ponies were shot at the base of the Beardmore Glacier. Less than 1/4 of the way to the pole, the brutal practice of man-hauling was to begin. Although they had dogs relaying supplies, the British refused to rely on them.
And the problems with efficient dog use is you have to train not only the dogs to work with the sledges, but you've got to train the men to work with the dogs. And this is not easily acquired. This is why the Norwegians, who'd used sledge dogs for a much longer period, were far more successful.
Moreover, the British were strangely sentimental about the use of animals, preferring to punish themselves instead. Amundsen, who would ultimately slaughter his dogs for meat, did not share this sentiment and carried man-hauling harnesses to remind his men that this instrument of torture awaited them if their dogs did not perform.
Part of his planning and part of his genius, of course, had to do with this whole issue of using the dogs as food for both the other dogs and for the men, which was horrifying to the English, of course.
Amundsen and his men skied as the dogs pulled the sleds. They made excellent time on the first leg of the journey across the Ross ice shelf, often covering 20 miles a day, twice as many as Scott. Scott was falling behind. His only hope was that Amundsen, who was pioneering his own route, would not find a way up the Axel-Heiberg Glacier and through the mountains.
Scott knew that he could go up the Beardmore Glacier because that's what Shackleton had done. Amundsen had to pioneer a brand new route, but he had absolutely no fear of doing this because he had men with him who could pop up glaciers, as he said, like flies going up a wall.
On November 19th, Amundsen stood at the foot of the Axel-Heiberg Glacier, a daunting rise of 8,000 feet over 20 miles, as opposed to the gradual 100-mile ascent Scott faced on the Beardmore. Amundsen and his surviving 42 dogs attacked the incline, hauling the sledges up in relays. He was on the polar plateau in just 4 days and was headed for the pole. Scott and company man-hauled 200 pounds each up the Beardmore Glacier. Under greater strain, they were already showing signs of weakening. And their problems stemmed from more than their labors. Their diet, since arriving in Antarctica, had been deficient in vitamin C, predisposing them to scurvy. In addition, the British were more susceptible to the colder temperatures on the plateau. Their clothing, Burberry and woolen underclothes, were not nearly as warm and dry as the Norwegian reindeer and wolfskin parkas that Amundsen designed, following traditional Eskimo garments. What Scott and his men had in ample supply was iron will, bolstered by the hope that they could beat the Norwegians to the pole. If this were possible, it would give them the strength to make it back alive. As they looked out at the vastness of the polar plateau, they could not know where the Norwegians were, or that they were in a race for their lives.
It's commonly asserted there was a race for the pole. Undoubtedly, Amundsen was going as quickly and efficiently as he could. He was racing, but I don't think it's correct to say Scott was racing. There was no doubt that Scott wanted to bag the pole first, but the slower exploration and more information coming from Scott's expedition was a major factor. It delayed him, as did his less efficient transport.
Encumbered by a large, multitask expedition, the British had never intended to race to the South Pole. The Norwegians were at home in the frozen expanses. The British, having returned their one dog team to base camp and having shot their ponies, were now reduced to what Scott termed the noble art of man-hauling.
So there is, if you like, an amateurism about Scott's expeditions, which, looking back, it is hard for us not to criticize and say, why were they not more professional? Amundsen is something of a man out of his time. He is so single track. He's very one-eyed.
Amundsen was somewhere out there on the ice, but Scott had no way of knowing where. Having man-hauled supply-packed sleds to the top of the Beardmore Glacier, Scott's team and a supporting party, 8 men in all, were now up on the polar plateau, 150 miles from the South Pole. Scott selected the team that would go on to the pole, the men that history would remember.
He made what people regard as his major mistake, which was to put 5 people into the polar party instead of the 4 that all the planning had been for.
The polar party consisted of Scott, Dr. Edward Wilson, Edgar Evans, Lawrence Oates, and the late addition of Henry Bowers, who was an expert navigator and a personal favorite of Scott's. Scott's decision to take Bowers had many downstream effects, but the most damning was a reduction in food. Burning 6,000 calories a day man-hauling, the men would be reduced to 4,500. They were starving from the start. Moreover, Scott's personnel selections were questionable. Unlike Amundsen, whose decisions were based on expertise, Scott selected Captain Oates because he wanted a representative of the Army with him. Fitter men were sent home.
He was the guy who looked after the horses. But of course all the horses were dead after a certain point from base camp, and you could argue that Captain Oates wasn't needed, and he also had a wound from the Boer War in his thigh, and he couldn't even walk properly, but he was really picked for reasons of etiquette.
The British struggled onwards to the pole, through the thin air at 10,000 feet in elevation, and temperatures that were sinking to minus 20 degrees. Scott wrote, "Another 74 miles from the pole. Can we keep this up for 7 days? None of us ever had such hard work before." Robert Scott. Nevertheless, hopes were running high. What lots of things we think of on these monotonous marches. What castles one builds now, hopefully, that the pole is ours. Then disaster struck. Scott and company came across the remains of Amundsen's camp at the South Pole. The Norwegians have forestalled us and are first at the pole. All daydreams must go. It will be a wearisome return. Robert Scott. Captain Oates dryly observed, "The Norskies seem to have had a comfortable trip with their dog teams, very different to our wretched man-hauling." He could not have been more accurate. Almost 2 months earlier, on November 21st, after praising his dogs for their work in cresting the 8,000-foot slope of the Axel Heiberg Glacier, Amundsen stopped and slaughtered 24 of them on the polar plateau.
Amundsen actually figured out to the day when he would be slaughtering his dogs to feed to the other dogs and to the men. Like everything else that he did, this was meticulously planned.
The men and remaining dogs feasted on the fresh meat. Approaching the pole and warmed by their labors, the Norwegians set their heavy furs aside. On December 15th, they arrived at the South Pole, a month ahead of their British counterparts. It had taken them almost 2 months of skiing and sled driving to cover the 800 miles from their starting point in the Bay of Whales. "God be thanked," was Amundsen's only comment. On their journey, Amundsen, his expert skiers and dog drivers, had made almost twice the daily mileage while carrying double the weight in supplies as the British. This allowed Amundsen to lay food depots at each degree of latitude, or 60 nautical miles apart, as opposed to 100 miles for Scott. The Norwegians would be well provisioned on their return.
Amundsen got to the pole in record time and without any difficulty at all, and clearly chose the right method of transport.
Amundsen's trip to the South Pole was a walk in the park. He was an extremely meticulous, very careful planner, and his success on the South Pole had to do with his brilliant planning, his ability as an explorer. This was a place where nobody had ever been before. These were the last places on Earth, the untouched places on Earth. And it was an amazing time because mankind was conquering their own environment.
After 2.5 months of backbreaking work, on January 17, 1912, Scott would stand in the same spot. Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority. Now for the run home and a desperate struggle. I wonder if we can do it.
So the real problems for Scott started around January, in part probably the psychological depression of being second. And you see that in the famous photographs of his men standing at the South Pole. I think it had an enormous effect too on others who thought that this was going to be their way for personal fame and glory. And secondly, then they started to feel the effects of cold. And not surprisingly, because it was getting colder.
The British were at the pole a month later, and it was a month closer to winter. The temperature had dropped a critical 5 degrees. Scott's men were exhausted and malnourished. As they began slowing down, they had to reduce their rations so that they could make it from one food depot to the next. None of this was in Scott's plan. The Norwegians, buoyed by their success in getting to the pole, began the race home to announce their news to the world.
So they were doing these in sometimes even 25 kilometers in a day, I mean just in huge distances. And on top of this, he laid down so many food depots on the the barrier on the way back that he said he was at the flesh pots of Egypt. There was so much food. In fact, they were feeding chocolate to the dogs occasionally. They had so much food. So they had vast excess of food, incredible energy. The dogs were in great top shape. The man, the skiing, everything was just cranking. And so he got back in January all the way to his base at Framheim in the Bay of Wales, and boom, the ship was there and he was out of there.
The Norwegians returned from the pole in less than 6 weeks and left the continent on January 30th. Remarkably, they had covered 1,400 miles without sickness or accident. The British were still up on the polar plateau as the Antarctic winter approached, the coldest winter anywhere on Earth. P.O. Evans was beginning to lose heart.
And I think what got Scott and his men to the pole was sheer willpower. And when they found that they were there second, I think psychologically that had a huge impact for their survival on the way back.
Evans had plans of opening a pub and basking in the afterglow of polar fame. Failure had hit him the hardest. They were midway down the Beardmore Glacier on February 13th when Evans collapsed. Captain Oates recorded, "We found him on his hands and knees in the snow in the most pitiful condition." Evans was comatose by the time they got him into the tent. He died later that night. Despite their dire situation, the remaining men gathered geological samples and added them to their sledge burden.
It's almost as if that little bag of fossils was the essence, the purpose of the whole trip, and that to throw them away at this stage was, you might just well throw yourself away. And so he put them back on the sledge. I think it was a great symbolic gesture.
By early March, the men were losing hope. They faced midday temperatures of minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Food and fuel shortages awaited them at the remaining depots, the result of poor planning and Scott's decision to add Bowers to the pole party. Oates was suffering from scurvy that had opened an old war wound on his leg, and from frostbite to both his feet.
When he allowed Dr. Wilson to look at them, basically he needed a double amputation. He was in a terrible state, and he knew that they were too far away from base camp for him to make it. And the account in Scott's diary says that he was hoping not to wake up, but he did. It was the 17th of March, it was his 32nd birthday. And he left the tent saying, "I'm just going outside and maybe some time." And that has gone into folklore in British history.
Oates stepped out of the tent into a blizzard. The others watched, knowing that he was committing suicide rather than continue suffering and risk holding them back. They never saw him again. The remaining three turned their attention to their own survival and struggled onward for another 2 days.
They were about 11 miles south of something they called One Ton Depot, which is about 150 miles from their base at McMurdo. And then a blizzard hit them. This was in March, very cold. They knew that they were 11 miles away from food.
Driven into their tent by a severe blizzard, the men languished for 10 days as provisions ran short. Scott's final diary entry of March 29th read, "I do not think we can hope for better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. For God's sake, look after our people." Their frozen bodies were found inside the tent the next Antarctic summer.
And Scott was in the middle of the tent. Wilson and Bowers were either side of him, and Wilson and Bowers looked very peaceful apparently, but Scott looked like he'd struggled with death.
There were many people who believed that Scott and his team died because of broken hearts. Of course, it is a terrible thing to get to the pole and to realize that somebody has been there before you.
This memorial to the fallen men, a simple wooden cross, stands in McMurdo Sound and bears an epitaph from Tennyson's Ulysses. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. But perhaps the real lesson of Scott's death is one that all great explorers must learn at one time or another, and it is one of yielding, of knowing when to let go of one's goals and turn back in the interest of survival. Scott's old rival, Ernest Shackleton, the consummate Antarctic survivor, would soon return to test his luck a third time in this unforgiving environment. His epic journey, the most dramatic expedition of the heroic age, would redefine the limits of human endurance. The explorer Sir Raymond Priestley once wrote, "For scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency of travel, give me Amundsen. But when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton." By all quantifiable measures, Ernest Shackleton's 1914 expedition to Antarctica was a disaster. But by rising to the challenge of a spectacular sequence of setbacks, Shackleton and his men transcended conventional notions of success and failure.
If you were to write the story of an impossible journey and you'd say, well, this is the level of impossibility, and then you say, well, let's push it a little bit further. And then just as you think nothing could possibly worse than this, boom, it gets worse. And then it can't get worse than this, and it gets worse and worse and worse. So it's almost surrealistic how terrible it is.
Their 2-year odyssey was the high-water mark of courage and endurance in the heroic age. Having been beaten to the South Pole after coming within a heartbreaking 97 miles of setting foot on it in 1909, Ernest Shackleton sought one last milestone to add luster to his name. He proposed a trans-Antarctic expedition, an 1,800-mile trek that would culminate with his Weddell Sea landing party meeting up with a Ross Sea landing party atop the Beardmore Glacier.
The other vessel, Aurora, landed on Ross Island and was to have depots and supplies put all the way up to the bottom of the Beardmore Glacier. So the crossing party would only need to get to the base of that glacier and be provided for the rest of the journey.
On November 5th, 1914, Shackleton and the 27 men aboard the Endurance
more than expected. That was a bad ice year, but he had the expedition. It was all ready, planned. The alternative was leaving it for a year. He couldn't practically do that. So he took Endurance south.
After 6 weeks of zigzagging through a puzzle of ice, the ship could no longer find its way out. By January 19th, they were frozen into and drifting with a pressure pack, ice that was being forced together by the ocean's currents. A month later, trapped in the ice, the Endurance drifted to within sight of land. The 77th parallel was the furthest south the ship would go before being pulled back out to sea. The men made every attempt to cut open a passageway for the ship. But with the approach of the Antarctic winter, it seemed certain that they would be stalled in the ice until spring, 7 months later. They settled into their winter quarters aboard the ship, which they now called the Ritz. But the experience was far from settling. Caught between opposing ice floes, the ship was being gradually crushed.
Pressure ridges were pushing meter-thick sea ice on top of it, and still more pressure was coming. That's when no ship, at least no ship of that period, could endure it.
It took 10 months for the ice to consume the ship.
Caught in what was referred to as the mills of ice. She was twisted, bent, and broken The end was fairly obvious.
Stripped of all vital provisions, the leaking ship was abandoned in October and sank on November 21st, 1915. Heartsick, the men watched it go down. They camped on the melting ice and continued to live off the land, hunting seal and penguin. Never far from their 3 lifeboats, they were always on the move in search of firmer ice.
When you've got this terrible mixture of ice floes, weak ice and everything broken up, it's useless for a sledge and dangerous for a boat. What does one do?
With the pack disintegrating around him, Shackleton was now facing his greatest challenge. He ordered his men into the boats. After 15 months of exposure on the ice, they were now facing a new order of hardship: open boat travel in frigid Antarctic waters. Making matters worse, some of the men were sick because of the switch from fresh seal meat to sledging rations, the preserved food meant for use on the trans-Antarctic journey. They sailed for the nearest land, Elephant Island, 100 miles out to sea.
3 boats in open, freezing ocean in the Antarctic winter. The waves were smashing in against you, making you freezing cold. They did this for 8 days in those 3 boats until they reached Elephant Island.
Elephant Island was essentially a lump of rock, offering little or no shelter. But after frozen days in open boats that marked the beginning of their second Antarctic winter, and 500 days since they had walked on dry land, the men were, quite literally, delirious to come ashore. They soon discovered that their haven was continually lashed by blizzards, and morale sank dangerously close to mutiny. Shackleton wasted little time in announcing that he and a crew of 5 would set out from Elephant Island in one of the boats, the James Caird, to attempt an 800-mile journey to South Georgia Island, seeking rescue from the very same whalers who had warned him of the ice conditions at the outset of their expedition. The day after Easter, 1916, the James Caird set out in a northeasterly direction. Elephant Island rewarded the 22 men who remained with a 2-week blizzard. For these worst of times, Shackleton left his second-in-command, the indomitable Frank Wild, in charge.
Wild was the only man that could have controlled the slightly dispirited and warring factions that were beginning to raise their heads when things were getting really unhappy and depressing, and when probably half of them thought, well, what chance have they got in that little boat of getting to South Georgia?
There was little chance. Many better-equipped boats had gone down in these same waters. Life on board the James Caird was hellish.
Tempestuous oceans, bounced around all the time, cold and wet with salt water. Inadequate food, insufficient water, the fresh water became contaminated. Vast amounts of ice forming on her, becoming heavier and slower.
To escape the elements, the men would go below the deck they had added for the journey and sit on the ballast rocks.
And so they would huddle down below on these rocks and try not to move at all, because if they moved, water would go down their neck. And so and the fact that you were getting wet every couple of minutes for the days and days and weeks that they were at sea, it would absolutely crush anybody's spirits.
Despite the conditions, their navigational work had to be exact. Their target, South Georgia Island, was a small dot in a large ocean. If they were blown past it, they would die at sea. The job fell to Captain Frank Worsley to measure the exact position of the sun with his sextant.
The idea of bracing himself to hold the sextant and get a sight when the sun was just a fuzz and half the time hidden by the next wave, it's the most stupendous piece of seamanship.
15 days after their departure, the men made the perilous landing on South Georgia Island. But their arduous journey was still not over. They had landed on the uninhabited side of the island and would have to cross it to get help.
It's this little piece of rock sitting way out in the South Atlantic with super high mountains and cold and glaciers that had never been crossed before by anybody, including the whalers who were on the other side. So they had to pioneer a route across this mountain.
Shackleton selected Tom Crean and Worsley to make the climb with him. Lacking survival gear, they would have to make the trek without sleep. They began their ascent of snowfields and glaciers to an altitude of 4,500 feet.
And they've been already on foot, climbing for 20 hours. They are absolutely exhausted, feel that they can go not one step further. And Shackleton says, okay, you two, you go to sleep. And he lets them sleep for all of 5 minutes, and then he shakes them awake and says, okay, chaps, you've had your half hour, and then on they go. And what that says to me, first of all, clearly his concern and sensitivity to the needs of his men, but also the subtle psychology, letting them believe that they've had 30 minutes, when in fact he knows that he can only allow them 5, because if they have more than 5, they will probably die.
At 7 a.m. the next morning, they heard the steam whistles summoning the whalers to work.
Upon arriving at the whaling station, having crossed South Georgia, they walked up to the station manager's home and knocked on his door, and the man came out and didn't know who these ragamuffins were, didn't recognize them. And Shackleton put out his arm and they shook hands and said, "Don't you recognize me? I'm Shackleton." And it is said that the station master, who's a tough Norwegian whaler who'd seen a lot of hardship in his time, had tears in his eyes when he saw the shape these men were in.
A whaler immediately picked up the 3 men left on the other side of the island. But it took 105 days and 4 rescue attempts for Shackleton to return to Elephant Island to retrieve the 22 men marooned there. Incredibly, despite repeated disaster, not a single man from his Weddell Sea party had been lost. 6 years later, Shackleton returned to Antarctica at the head of another expedition. On January 4th, 1922, within sight of South Georgia Island, he died of a massive heart attack, bringing the heroic age of exploration to a close. Soon, an ingenious American would bring a new brand of exploration to the frozen continent. It was the dawning of the mechanical age, and Antarctica would be the ultimate test of a new mode of transportation. The stories of the heroic age, of men armed with little more than their will against the raw elements, had built up a hero cult around Antarctic explorers. The public's hunger for larger-than-life figures was undiminished throughout the 1920s.
Back in the 1920s, it was the age of heroes. This was when you had Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, you had Charles Lindbergh, you had famous people, individuals who were prominent in the headlines almost every day.
Among those aspiring to fame was Richard Byrd. At the end of World War I, Byrd, a 28-year-old lieutenant, retired from the Navy for medical reasons and focused on promoting aviation through publicity-grabbing flights. The first to claim credit for flying over the North Pole in 1926, Byrd soon sought another first.
Byrd wanted to make the big headlines, the first to fly over the North Pole and the first to fly over the South Pole. He conducted his business in a way that even he called the hero business. It was a way of making himself famous and therefore being able to raise funds to conduct his explorations.
In 1927, Byrd set about planning a privately financed Antarctic expedition. It would be the largest and most ambitious to date, and would usher in a new age of exploration in Antarctica, the mechanical age.
He was very interested in using a three-engine aircraft under the most hostile of environments, of flying conditions, in order to prove that the airplane was in fact a viable instrument of transportation and could be used reliably.
With 2 years of preparations behind him, Byrd arrived in Antarctica with 3 airplanes, 24 radio transmitters, 95 dogs, and 42 men. On Christmas Day, 1928, after struggling through the sea ice, they landed at the Bay of Whales and picked a spot for their base just 4 miles north of Amundsen's old camp, Framheim. Men and machines built a compound in 2 weeks, and Byrd dubbed it Little America. Byrd and company settled in for the Antarctic winter to prepare for the polar flight.
Byrd was very cautious about this flight. He sent out a supply party, and all of this was in an effort that if something should happen on that flight, that they would be near other people and possibly near supply depots for a rescue to happen.
As a further safety measure, the expedition would be the first to make extensive use of radio.
Byrd also used radio for field parties. The geological party had radios on its sledges. The so-called supporting party had radios on its sledges. There were radios in the airplanes. And Byrd was able to tie the expedition together this way, able to coordinate his activities.
On November 29, 1929, 4 men boarded the plane for the flight to the South Pole. Richard Byrd, navigator. Harold June, radio operator. Ashley McKinley, aerial photographer, and Bernd Balken, pilot. They would fly a Ford trimotor to the pole. The plane was new and unproven.
Byrd wanted to be sure, as always, that he and the men would arrive back safely, so they crammed the plane full of survival gear and food.
Balken, an expert at instrument flight, managed to lift the overloaded plane off the runway. Oddly, for a pioneer of aviation, Byrd was not a calm flyer. In this case, he had good cause for worry. Instrument navigation above an uncharted landscape, lubricants that were prone to freezing, and of course, gale force winds, all made Antarctic flight dangerous for these early planes. Anxiety mounted as they approached the 10,000-foot-high Axel Heiberg Glacier at the head of the mountains.
Byrd had to get over these mountains, and in the low-flying planes of the day, that was quite a challenge. The planes really had very little capability for altitude. They were not pressurized. As they got to the range, Byrd saw that the pass that he intended to fly through was blocked by clouds. It looked like bad weather. So he had to go to Plan B. Plan B was to fly up another glacier. So they headed up the glacier. The plane started to gain on altitude. They went up and up and up. And finally they got to a point where there was a mountain in the middle of the glacier, sticking right up through the glacier.
The pass had become so narrow that they could not turn around. The pilot, Balken, pulled back on the stick, but the plane could not go higher.
Byrd had an expert pilot at the controls, Bernd Balken. He surveyed the surrounding topography and figured there must be air flowing down off the polar plateau, then going up a mountain to his right. So he flew over that way, and the plane was jostling and shaking. And you've got to imagine the motors are so loud you can't hear each other speak. Couldn't quite get up enough height. Balken said, "Throw out the food bags."
They gained altitude, but not enough. With Balken yelling for more, they jettisoned additional food and empty gasoline tins. Still, they were heading straight into the mountaintop. At the last moment, Falcon found the updraft that he was looking for, and it lifted them safely onto the polar plateau. On November 29th at 1:14 a.m., Byrd passed a note to the pilots that read, "We have reached the South Pole." In just 16 hours, Byrd's team had completed a journey that had taken Roald Amundsen 3 months. In the summer of 1930, Byrd returned to New York a hero. The same year, he was promoted to Rear Admiral.
Your contribution to exploration and scientific research has done honor to this country.
Byrd seized the momentum and began planning his 1933-1935 Antarctic expedition with his usual flair for generating publicity.
The major highlight was the adventure that Byrd had in setting up a meteorology station 100 miles or so inland. No one had ever wintered over in the interior of Antarctica.
Byrd intended to winter alone at a tiny base buried beneath the surface of the ice 123 miles inland from Little America. Temperatures dropped to minus 96 degrees Fahrenheit. What began as a publicity stunt turned into a fight for his life.
He really ran into problems because while he was alone at the base, he had a stove that was faulty and it emitted carbon monoxide fumes.
He's getting dizzy, he has bouts of unconsciousness. He turns the stove off at night to reduce the carbon monoxide fumes, but of course it's the stove that's also keeping him alive.
And imagine yourself out there in this little tiny building under the snow, because it was buried by snow, all alone, just the sound of the wind, the darkness for 6 months out of the year. It was a very stressful thing psychologically. And I suspect that Byrd cracked a little.
And Byrd is in such despair that at one point he thinks of committing suicide.
As Byrd's radio transmissions became increasingly incoherent, concern grew at Little America. Against Byrd's stated orders, a tractor party from Little America crossed heavily crevassed terrain in the Antarctic night to rescue the expedition leader.
They reached him, found him in an awful condition, so bad they couldn't bring him back right away. Byrd never did get healthy again. He died as a relatively young man in his 60s, and one of his close friends told me he just never recovered from an awful experience at advanced base.
Byrd returned to Antarctica at the head of 3 additional expeditions, but he was increasingly marginalized by the very process that he had set in motion.
At the end of his career, the expeditions had become so large that no single individual could be responsible for raising private money.
As Byrd's star faded, Cold War expansionism extended into Antarctica in the form of territorial claims. A pristine and vulnerable wilderness, the continent needed politically savvy allies, and they would come from an unlikely quarter. Far from the battlefields of World War II, the frozen continent of Antarctica was, for what would be the last time in its modern history, forgotten by a planet seemingly bent on its own destruction. The continent's hostile environment kept hostility from its shores. But soon enough, this virgin territory that had exerted its pull on the explorers at the turn of the 20th century would tempt the empire builders of the Cold War. In the late 1940s, countries began to assert claims to Antarctic territories.
Even though people didn't really know what they might be able to accomplish by owning pieces of Antarctica, still the pull of territorial claim is very, very strong, as it has been throughout history.
Antarctica found itself in the midst of a land grab. Argentina, Australia, the United Kingdom, Chile, France, New Zealand, and Norway sliced off sections of the Antarctic pie from the Southern Ocean to the South Pole.
After World War II, the United States got quite involved in pushing for some construct in Antarctica that did not allow for individual claims.
Eisenhower's fears of Soviet intervention intensified when the Soviets announced that they would not recognize the territorial claims of others and seemed ready to slice off their own piece of the Antarctic pie. The stage was set for open conflict until a group of scientists came up with an idea to do some solid science that would require international cooperation. Momentum built quickly in the international scientific community and in U.S. governmental circles as well. The American operation, 7 ships and 1,800 men, was dubbed Operation Deep Freeze and had 2 stages. Landing in McMurdo Sound like the British explorers earlier in the century, the U.S. would build a base and an airfield there in 1955 and use it as the springboard to construct the South Pole Station the next season.
And in many ways, the American strategy was to follow in the footsteps of Scott. Scott went to McMurdo because it had open ocean that you could get a ship into, so you could bring in supplies, and then launch from there to the South Pole.
An aging Admiral Byrd was recruited for the expedition, but he was little more than a figurehead. He would die 2 years later. Rear Admiral George Dufek assumed effective command and focused attention on the first objective, McMurdo. Before anything could be built, 20,000 tons of cargo would have to be unloaded onto unstable sea ice. Responsibility fell on the shoulders of construction officer Dick Bowers and his men.
We found the sea ice extended over 40 nautical miles north of Cape Armitage, which meant that we had to offload our ships onto that ice, onto tractor trains and sleds, and haul it over the ice 40 plus miles to our base site.
To have to bring down every pint of fuel, to have to bring down every screw, every piece of wood, and to build a station was a very bold move.
Always in the Antarctic, the clock is ticking. The season is very short, and the ships have to get out while they still can.
At McMurdo, the conditions were terrible, particularly in the winter. I called it a frigid hell. Our people were working out on the runways, removing snow from the ice, doing all sorts of things there in temperatures of 45, 50 below, sometimes 60 below, and high winds, in darkness, in complete darkness.
Both the station and the runways were completed just in time to launch the pole station the next season. Bowers credits his men.
Most of them were what I refer to as farm-type individuals who would not become frustrated when they ran into problems.
It was now time to build the pole station. 84 supply flights dropped 760 tons of supplies and building materials at the South Pole site for a massive construction effort that was completed ahead of schedule. The building was finished by March of 1957, in time for a team of 18 men to be the first to winter at the South Pole. 12 countries, 60 bases, and hundreds of scientists participated in the International Geophysical Year of 1957-58. Discoveries were made in the fields of cosmic ray research, climatology, oceanography, and Earth's atmosphere. It was the largest scientific effort to that date.
It was very clear very early that the IGY was a stroke of genius from a political point of view as well as a scientific point of view.
The IGY's success led to the Antarctic Treaty, which 12 countries signed on December 1st, 1959, and remains in effect today.
And the whole concept of the Antarctic Treaty was to have a continent on Earth that was demilitarized, that was an international environment, and that was not intended to have any extractive use.
If you have got a wonderful area like this, a proper, honest-to-God, unsullied wilderness, people ought just to have a glimpse of it, if only to realize what the value of such a place is to the world.
But can it remain unsullied when it is under assault from half a world away? When the very wind and water that first carried mankind to its shores now bring pollution? In the 21st century, scientists are the primary explorers of an Antarctica that remains wild and vast. And they are following directly in the footsteps of the British scientists who came a century ago with Robert Falcon Scott.
Scott brought this multidisciplinary team to Antarctica. And I'm always struck by that 100 years later as I walk around the same places that his scientists walked around 100 years ago. And I bump into colleagues who are physicists and chemists and geologists, just like Scott did. The idea is you have all these scientists with all these different disciplines studying in parallel how things work, even using some of the data sets and publications that those scientists gave us 100 years ago. And I consider all of that to be the huge legacy of the British explorers at the turn of the century, that they brought science in a way that worked and still works to this day.
Today, advances in science and communications allow us a more meaningful connection to the continent. But this connection comes at a price. The very engine that drives these advances, industrial expansion that feeds the global marketplace, threatens to upset Earth's delicate balance, and with it, Antarctica.
I think of Antarctica as being this environmental signal to us about the health of planet Earth. Between issues of global warming and ozone and so forth, the Antarctica is absolutely a phenomenal laboratory to study these things and maybe tell us things are going wrong long before we know that it's beyond hope back here in temperate North America.
The National Science Foundation in Washington, D.C. oversees the U.S. program in Antarctica and is one of the main arbiters in its fate. The Foundation's goals are threefold.
One is to conduct forefront research that can best be done or only be done on that continent. Secondly, to protect the environment, to be good stewards of that pristine environment. Thirdly, to help maintain the wildlife, particularly the marine wildlife, in the waters around the continent.
An ongoing penguin census is an integral part of assessing the health of the continent. Unfortunately for scientists, penguin counting is still done the old-fashioned way.
Conducting the census down here is actually quite simple. We use the lowest tech equipment that we possibly can. It's basically a metal clicker, and the clicker records a count every time we depress the notch. It's a bit like going into Mile High Stadium on a Sunday afternoon. The penguin's sitting in the stands and you're down on the field.
Despite standing room only conditions at this colony, the census is telling scientists that some populations, particularly Adelie penguins found in coastal Antarctica, are in decline because their food source, krill, is diminishing.
The story that's evolving is the story of sea ice and its importance to krill population dynamics. Sea ice provides a refugia for larval krill.
By all reports, the sea ice on the peninsula is vanishing in an ever-warming environment.
So you have a set of sort of cascading circumstances in which you've got climate warming, increasing temperatures, a reduction in the amount of sea ice, a reduction in the amount of krill, and that is also affecting Adelie penguins because they are krill dependent.
So, a simple click registers a symptom of one of the most complex of problems, global warming.
on the western Antarctic Peninsula. Over the last 50 years, midwinter temperatures have increased by somewhere in the order of 9 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is one of the largest temperature increases recorded on the planet.
And in a global context, the implications of a warmer Antarctica can be alarming.
Geologists have estimated that about 70% of our planet's fresh water is tied up in the Antarctic ice cap. That's a tremendous amount of fresh water. And what that means is that this tremendous volume of water, now sitting above sea level as dry ice, if it were to melt, would flood the ocean basins and cause sea level to rise somewhere around 320 feet.
Antarctica has already shown us that we can affect the global environment negatively and dramatically. Evidence of this first appeared in 1985, when a group of British scientists discovered that concurrent with the rising of the Antarctic sun in August, a hole was opening in the ozone layer over the continent. The ozone layer, an invisible shield in the stratosphere, prevents most of the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation from penetrating to the Earth's surface.
The preliminary evidence, and it's pretty good evidence, is that the UV that's coming through because of the ozone hole is damaging the DNA of phytoplankton, krill, and so on.
Scientists soon discovered that cold conditions above Antarctica were increasing the ozone-destroying power of an industrial chemical, chlorofluorocarbons. CFCs were banned in 1987.
It's one of the few examples I can think of when science so quickly laid a foundation for an international agreement on a very, very economically important chemical. Many people would say that alone justifies the effort that's gone into the research program in Antarctica over all of the years.
Scientists predict that it will take 50 to 100 years for the ozone layer to recover. And if and when it does recover, mankind will be able to look all the way back to the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, to give credit to the men who first brought science to the frozen continent.
All the knowledge gained during this heroic period is now, with modern interpretations, becoming increasingly important, as it is older and more accurate to see how things are changing on the planet. This information is definitely coming into its own again, almost a century later.
The water and wind that ushered early explorers to Antarctica now bring her increased temperatures that threaten the defining feature of the continent, the ice. Were the ice cap to begin melting, the fate of this faraway place would be forced to the forefront of global consciousness. But it should not take a crisis to turn our minds to this other world in our midst. Antarctica offers itself not merely as a witness to individual achievement, but also as a lesson to those who would take nature's bounty for granted. We can only hope that the spirit and creativity that explorers showed in Antarctica's conquest will be shown in its defense.